Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York in Bayside, Queens. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. This evening's presentation is entitled The Impetus to Remember, Holocaust Memorials Erected by Jewish Burial Societies. Our featured guests include Susannah Trubman, Learning and Media Educator at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, Adam Ginsberg, President of Mount Hebron Cemetery, and Deirdre Poulos, Director of the Mount Hebron Legacy Foundation. And the discussion will focus on the history of the landsmanshaften, as well as how burial societies such as those at Mount Hebron became the only remaining pieces left of these communities in the wake of the Holocaust. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center in Bayside, New York is situated on the traditional land of the Mantinecock people who continue to live here today. We offer gratitude and respect to all of the indigenous people of Turtle Island, past, present, and future, including the Lenape and Shinnecock peoples. Today's program is underwritten by the Ava Bobro Memorial Fund and is co-sponsored by 9 organizations around the country, including the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center in White Plains, the Legacy Foundation at Mount Hebron Cemetery, the Center for Genocide and Human Rights Research in Africa and the Diaspora at Northeastern Illinois University, the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University, the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan University, the Ray Walpaugh Institute for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at Western Washington University, the Reef Center for Human Rights and Conflict Resolution at Christopher Newport University, the Holocaust Resource and Education Center at Keene University, and the Institute of Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at Binghamton University. I'd like to thank our colleagues from the Media Services and Digital Transformation departments, including Phil Roncaroni, Jesse Pina, Maher Hossein, as well as Barana Soman, the KHC's museum coordinator. This event tonight is happening simultaneously online and in person. So before we begin, a reminder for those of you in the room to please turn off your cell phones. And after the presentation, we'll host a brief Q&A session. So for those of you joining online, please drop your question in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll also pass the mic around for those of you here at the center. Now it's my great pleasure to welcome our first guest, Ms. Susannah Trubman. Susannah holds a BA in English Literature from University of Wisconsin-Madison and an MA in History from Temple University. She currently works as an educator for the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research's Learning and Media Center. Prior to this work, Susannah was a landsmanshaften archival intern with YIVO and has researched these societies and their memory work extensively. Susannah, welcome aboard.
Hello, Shalom Aleichem, good Abend. I'm so glad to be here tonight to talk about landsmanshaften and immigrant aid societies generally. A landsmanschaft, it's simply just a term in Yiddish for what were Jewish mutual aid societies created by Jewish immigrants, often Yiddish speaking, but not exclusively, who emigrated from Central and Eastern Europe to the United States. The major Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe happening in the 1880s. From there on, that's when the large proportion of Yiddish speakers came to the United States, and that's right away when landsmanshaften came into existence. As soon as Jews came to the United States, one of the biggest concerns, of course, was who will bury me, who will look after me, how do I have a community here? And landsmanshaften were a way to ensure that not only their social needs were met, but their needs of having proper burial, of having often a sort of social safety net prior to the introduction of the New Deal. The landsmanshaften stood for that. It just simply means countrymen's organization. By the 1950s, the number of landsmanshaften in New York alone was over 6,000, and it's not a New York exclusive phenomenon. Anywhere where Jewish immigrants moved, there could be a landsmanschaft, no matter how small the town was. There could even be multiple landsmanshaften operating independently for decades at a time, and they were all across the country, from Philadelphia to Denver to San Francisco, and also all around the world. It's really a global phenomenon. And like I said, they offered all sorts of social benefits, tangible benefits in the form of insurance, loans, burial, but they also offered a lot of intangible benefits to their members, primarily a social connection and a connection to the homes that they had left behind. Because for many Jewish immigrants, they didn't necessarily identify with the country they were from. They may not have had full citizenship rights. The borders often changed, but they identified as Jews and they identified as people from the town that they were from. The hometown was really key to them. So they might say, I'm a Jew and I'm a Washaber. So having that connection to the homes that they left behind was truly crucial. There are a number of different types of landsmanshaften, main names, and I will tell you, despite the number of different names, a lot of times they had similar purposes and similar things that they did. It just depends, when they came into being, what was their original purpose. Many started off as burial societies and offered other benefits as time went on. Some were started as hometown associations primarily, but then they could go on to include a burial society or even a synagogue. There were also relief societies, and I'd mention this for those of you who might research landsmanshaften. Those can be very interesting when you encounter them because it can be a general name for just a philanthropic society, but it could also be a group of landsmanshaften joining together, often from the same town or region, in order to provide aid. This happened primarily in World War I and World War II, and you can see a lot of organizations banding together during that time to increase their efforts. And the other term I'll mention is Hevra Anshai. Again, it's just a friendly society. But they tend to have a more synagogue connotation, initially at least. Landsmanshaften often helped provide their members with very, very active social lives, I'll say. On this slide that you see here, you can see a number of the souvenir journals that are in YIVO's collection. YIVO has quite a collection of landsmanshaften journals, and they're a wonderful little peek into the past because you can get a lot of information from them as a historian, as a genealogist. You can know where were they meeting, who was everyone in the landsmanshaften, who was buying ads, and you can often find their menus, which some will recognize today because even back then they enjoyed celery. But we have quite a few of these in our archives, and they're just really fantastic resources. And it shows all of the social organization that was going on. These could be very sophisticated societies that lasted for decades. Some of them that were started in 1883, 1887. So by the 20s and 30s, they were already celebrating their 50th anniversaries, and they would continue on for some time, even with the introduction of more widely available loans and insurance. So most landsmanshaften were quite small. They operated independently, and this is something where you will see if you know that your family is from a certain town. Just because you find a landsmanshaften with members of people from that town, it doesn't mean that you had any connection, because they really were very stiff-necked. They tend to operate on their own, and it was often related to just families and friends who had similar relationships in the Alter Heim, the old country, and continued them over here. Though as time went on, it was well known in landsmanshaften that it was usually the son-in-laws who married into them that would have to be forced to take over presidential duties or treasuries. That was particularly contentious. These were, organizations with official rules that took extensive minutes. Usually we have decades and decades of minutes of organizational meetings. They operate along Robert's Rules of Order, and they consider themselves to be very official. One thing that you will see a ton of in the YIVO archives are organizational stamps, which have their official seal for each organization. And in some of the banquet journals I mentioned, these landsmanshaften would often write to numerous politicians to get letters of congratulations for their anniversaries, including Fiorello LaGuardia and President Roosevelt. So even as the need for financial support for these immigrant communities waned, the need for social connection and the need to support their hometowns was really what kept a lot of these groups going. And in fact, it's estimated that some of these organizations provided as much as 30% of their hometowns' GDP, essentially, because especially during the 1920s and 30s, Jewish communities in Eastern Europe were facing increasing poverty, boycotts from their neighbors. It could be very desperate times, but you might see new inns or bathhouses being built. And in fact, in the YIVO archives, Jewish immigrants who became American citizens would travel back and often take home videos or pictures to report on the works that their societies had done for their hometowns. And so some of the videos we have of pre-war life in Eastern Europe only exist because of these groups. Another special case that I do want to mention that operates contrary to the smaller landsmanshaften is the Bialystoker Center. That was one of the largest landsmanshaften and was actually comprised of over 90 organizations. It's a special case, but an interesting one, and you can still see the Bialystoker Old Age Home, at least the building that they built, in Lower Manhattan. So landsmanshaften, as I said, in the 1930s, with the introduction of the New Deal, with lessening restriction on who would loan money to Jews, how they could access health insurance, business insurance, the financial need for landsmanshaften went away. And with immigration restriction in the 1920s, the new members of landsmanshaften, it became more limited to just the descendants of the original founders. You weren't seeing as many new members coming in, needing support, or simply being there at all. And some children of members would stay involved and keep the organizations going for quite some time. And I say this today, there are still landsmanshaften operating today in different ways than they originally did, but certainly still operating and meeting. But it became a bit more difficult as this lack of immediate connection to life in Eastern Europe waned. But with the war years, things would change significantly. Landsmanshaften in the post-war era primarily shifted toward memory work and toward support of the new state of Israel. During World War II, landsmanshaften did focus a lot on relief efforts. They had already had experience with this in World War I and had done what they could to support their communities then, but it quickly would become clear they were receiving reports that their hometowns in many cases were eliminated, and there would be some immigrants from them, but they may have found out at times that only as many as 5 or 6 people in towns of thousands had survived. And so many of these landsmanshaften members, they had a new purpose in mind. They had to make sure that their families, their friends, and their communities, as they remembered them, were remembered in some way, and they could not rely on public memorials, and they couldn't necessarily rely on mainstream historical work. So many different landsmanshaften operating separately began the work of creating what are called Yizkerbücher in Yiddish, or memory books in English. These were not brand new to the time. There had been previous memory books for destroyed Jewish communities, but the absolute scale of how many were created in the post-war era is unmatched. At YIVO alone, we have over 600 Yizkerbücher. Some of them were created in the immediate years following the war, and some of them, you still see new ones being published today after many years of hard work on them. And these were communal efforts. It could often be very contentious, and there were often debates over whether there should be more of a monument, say in cemeteries, or if there should be Yizkerbüchers, and to try to attempt this self-told history. it was very difficult. And in some cases, there would be years-long arguments, and you can see this reflected in the archive over what was the most appropriate way to remember their loved ones and how they could do that and have the most impact. Because in both ways, these memory efforts are more private, more personal. They are either to be visited at a burial plot for the society, or they exist in the form of Yizkarbücher that are just only really owned by the members of the Landsmanschaften. Some gained larger publishers later, but it's very unusual. In fact, one of the ones that I highlight on this screen, Lübbummel, was professionally published, and it's also particularly notable because in the 1970s, it was submitted as state's evidence in the attempted deportation of collaborators, or I should say accused collaborators from the town of Lübbummel who had emigrated to the United States and who were recognized and named. And this is a very rare case, but it reflects the writing of these books because most of the time they are, of course, looking back in fond memory, but they are also crying out and saying, "May God avenge their blood." This was an active work of memory. So in the last decades of their existence, this became their primary focus. Of course, they would also raise money for communities in Israel. And in fact, there were Landsmanschaften in Israel that they would be in contact with. But it was just, it was different. It didn't have the same immediate connection as they did in Eastern Europe, though it was another thing that sustained them. And they really followed the contours of American Jewish life and their commitment to memorial work and to supporting this new state. But yeah, groups who did not end up creating these memorial books, they would either be that or to choose a monument, and they would have a lot of meetings about it and a lot of discussions. It was really a major point for them because they were talking about how the only real public show, which was still very private and personal, what their relatives would be represented by. So many of the memorials that exist, they're also fascinating, and they really resemble their, what I think of as their brothers and sisters in the Yizkarbücher, and that they have a mix of languages, a mix of rhetoric in them that it's just really fascinating to see. And it always reflects when they were made, what group was making it. Was it survivors from the towns? Was it those who had emigrated earlier in the 1910s? It's really an understudied topic, though there is some fantastic scholarship out there about it. But like the Yizkarbücher, the monuments are often in a mix of Yiddish, English, Hebrew, sometimes Hungarian, but really whatever language was most comfortable to the Landsmanschaften. And in the point of transition these groups were usually in the post-war, they would usually pick two languages because they wanted the language that the older generation spoke, but they also wanted to make sure it would be relevant to the subsequent generations. Now, I do want to highlight how the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research collected Landsmanschaften records. We have one of the largest collections of Landsmanschaften materials in the United States, but it took quite some time. We're not the only one either. You can find them usually in local universities and archives. We initially attempted to collect these materials in the immediate era of World War II and also the immediate post-war era, but it was very difficult because for many of the groups who held these records, their records, they were not necessarily comfortable parting with the photos, the recollections of their towns so quickly after the war. So it took quite some time. And YIVO put out a subsequent call in 1979 for Landsmanschaften records. And by this time, many of these same records that we had hoped for, they had moved to another generation who had less immediate connection to them and who wanted to ensure that they would be preserved, knowing that they were no longer able to do so. So people sent in everything that they had, and I will say it's reflected in how our collection looks. We have thousands of records, but it really varies by society, just based on what has been sent in, what individuals had. For some, it's truly extensive, and for some, we might just have one meeting invitation. So I will say we are always collecting new materials, and if you want to send your landsmanshaften materials, reach out to me.
Susannah, that was incredible, and I really appreciate your talking very broadly about landsmanshaften and how they come together and the transition from really doing communal work and financial work to keep communities alive and really create sort of these lasting communal bonds, and then moving into the much more sadder work in the wake of the Holocaust to focusing on memory work. So I'm excited now to introduce our next speaker, Adam Ginsberg. He's the president of the Cedar Grove Cemetery Association in Queens, which consists of two cemeteries, a non-sectarian cemetery called Cedar Grove and a Jewish cemetery called Mount Hebron. Adam serves as a board member at a number of local cemeteries in New York, as well as for the Metropolitan Cemetery Association and New York State Association of Cemeteries. He founded the Legacy Foundation in 2019 in an effort to create educational, cultural programming, and community outreach at Mount Hebron Cemetery. Adam, the floor is yours.
Where's Susannah? Susannah, that was amazing. We've been dealing with burial societies. We're probably like the last institutions in America that deal with burial societies on a semi-regular basis. And Susannah just summed up so much information in 20 minutes, and it was so educational and right on point. So thank you for that. It was really good. So the first burial in Mount Hebron was in 1909, and since then there have been 230,000 funerals. Cemetery management is interested in learning more about the history contained within the gates at Mount Hebron. The story of the Jewish people is embedded here, and we want to unearth the meaningful stories about them. Cemeteries provide a space for the permanent memorialization of the people who lived and died in a community. But as the generations pass, and the memories of those loved ones fade and eventually disappear, the stories and sacrifices of those interred slip away and can be forgotten. The history of those resting at Mount Hebron Cemetery is not just a story of individuals, it's a story of a people who persevered to help to create our city and in turn our country. We want these stories to come alive and the legacies of those individuals and their cultural history be available to learn for generations. In 2019, the Legacy Project at Mount Hebron Cemetery and Cedar Grove Cemetery was a subsidiary project involving students from Queens College who were hired to assist our research into Jewish war veterans buried at Mount Hebron Cemetery. We quickly expanded the research to include everyone buried at our cemeteries. The Legacy Foundation was formally established in 2023 when it received 501(c)(3) tax-exempt status, allowing it to grow on its own. The Legacy Foundation gives us room to spend time unearthing the stories of those buried in our cemeteries and how they influenced our city, state, country, and in some cases, the world. We focus on research, programming, community outreach, collaboration, and education. The Legacy Foundation collaborates with local institutions, including public schools, museums, colleges, and elected officials, to encourage reflection, community, and learning. Together, we honor those who came before us and highlight the vital role cemeteries play in communal life. The story of Jewish immigration in New York City over the last 2 centuries reflects the broader immigration experience of today, and it can be told through the stories of the people buried at our cemetery. Through education and programming, we aim to share this history and ensure their lessons remain meaningful for future generations. Local college students are given an opportunity to put their studies into practice. We work with them to procure. We work with local colleges to procure students who are interested in studying the history of the cemetery and those resting within its gates. They are paid and can receive college credit for their work. Each year, we welcome the public to enjoy the Legacy Project's signature events, which brings stories to life in amazing ways. These events are free of charge and offer a great opportunity for the community to learn more about the amazing history at Mount Hebron. Some recent programs include a ceremony at the Yiddish Theater in Block 67, and flagging veterans' graves on Memorial Day and Veterans Day with the local junior ROTC at John Boehm High School. Visitors can explore our tours in person using GPS coordinates or take them virtually through our website. Among the most popular are the Yiddish Walk of Fame, the Jewish Gangster Tour, and the Holocaust Yiddish Actors. Visitors can learn about their lives and listen to recordings of their music and performances and songs. The Jewish Gangster Tour traces the history of Murder, Inc., a group tied to Jewish mobs, the Jewish mob that operated in the earliest 20th century. And then last is the Holocaust Memorial Tour that we're going to focus on today, the inscriptions of which use powerful language to recall the atrocities committed by the Nazis in the towns and cities whose names are emblazoned on the entrances to these grounds. The content created by our research is available on social media for consumption and education. It represents authentic and well-researched content that interacts with the global community and their connection to ours. I would like to introduce Deirdre Poulos, who is presenting on 4 selected Holocaust memorials, the burial societies they reside in, and some historical perspective about the towns that they represent. Deirdre Poulos is a director of the Legacy Foundation at Mount Hebron Cemetery. She began working with Mount Hebron nearly 20 years ago and have served in the ownership department, where she assists families with legal matters related to burial rights. For the past 6 years, she has been actively involved with the Legacy Foundation and Mount Hebron Cemetery. In her current role, she collaborates with researchers, runs the research team, the intern team, organizes public events, and oversees the foundation's website. She holds a dual master's degree in education from St. John's.
Thank you, Adam. And thank you as well, Laura, for inviting us to be here. And thank you, Susannah, for your beautiful representation of the landsmanshaften. Now, Holocaust memorials at Mount Hebron Cemetery. When we walk through Mount Hebron Cemetery in Queens, we are not just walking through a sea of stones. We are walking through a sacred archive of Jewish life and Jewish loss. Each path, each gate, each stone tells a story. More than 1,200 gates stand there. Many carved with names of towns that once thrived across Eastern Europe. Names like Lytton, Dubnow, Charterau appear besides hundreds of others. To most visitors, the names are unfamiliar, but they once belonged to places that were filled with sounds of Jewish life. There were markets, schools, songs, arguments, study halls, and Sabbath candles. The air carried rhythms of prayer and the laughter of children. That world vanished, but its memory endures in Queens. Before the war, letters crossed the ocean, written in Yiddish or Polish sometimes. They carried news of births, weddings, good harvests, small celebrations. Then the letters stopped. At first, the people waited, thinking the mail was delayed. Weeks turned into months, months into years. The silence grew heavier. In time, many understood that the people they loved were gone, and the towns they had left behind had been destroyed. Out of silence came a new purpose. The landsmanshaften, the immigrant societies that once helped newcomers find work and burial plots, turned instead to remembrance. They built monuments for towns that no longer existed, carving names and prayers in granite, so that what was lost would still have a place to live. Mount Hebron became more than a cemetery. It became an Ellis Island of memory, not a port of entry, but a port of remembrance. Here the journey ends not with the arrival, but with the return. Each gate and monument holds fragments of vanished worlds carried forward through time. To walk through this place is to move through landscape where the past still breathes, where silence speak and stones remember. Our first stop is a section of the Littner Podolier Aid Society, which came from Lytton. Lytton was a small town in Podolia, now central Ukraine. Jews had lived there since the 17th century. Over time, they ran mills, shops, inns, and built synagogues, study houses, and charitable institutions. Hasidic families lived alongside Zionist youth and Bundist laborers. Life in Lytton was humble, but deeply rooted in community and tradition. In 1942, that world was destroyed. The Jews of Lytton were rounded up, marched beyond the town limits, and murdered in open pits. More than 3,000 people were killed. By the war's end, only a few remained alive. In New York, Lytton's immigrants had long gathered through the Littner Podolier Aid Society. They built lives as tailors, peddlers, shopkeepers, pooling their resources to secure burial grounds together at Mount Hebron. After the Holocaust, they moved swiftly to memorialize their lost families. In 1947, they erected a monument, one of the first in New York, to honor victims from a specific town. The Lytton Memorial is made of gray granite, tall and austere. Its message is divided into two panels. The lower panel bears the dedication to the memory of the 3,940 Jewish residents of the town of Lytton, Ukraine, who were murdered by the Nazi barbarians during the years 1940 to 1943. They lay buried in two mass graves in the town of Lytton. The other panel honors two young men of Lytner descent who fought in the U.S. Army Air Force and died in combat, Lieutenants David Lipton and Philip Mordkowitz. Their inscription reads, "They gave their lives so that others might live." Together, these panels unite two stories, the murdered and the defenders, into one act of remembrance. The monument stands within a neatly bordered plot, its finished surface catching light even on cloudy days. Visitors leave small stones at the base, and some often lay a single flower across the engravement. It is a simple, direct, and profoundly human act. There are no symbols, only words, and through those words, the voices lost still speak. What makes Lytton Memorial remarkable is not the size or the decoration, but its urgency. It was raised just 2 years after the war ended, when grief was still raw and survivors still learning the full scope of loss. The Lytner Society did not wait for the historians to tell their story. They told it themselves, in stone that would not fade. In doing so, they transformed sorrow into permanence and memory into moral inheritance. A short distance away is the section of Dubner Young Friends Benevolent Society. Dubner was a town in Volhynia known for its fortress fairs and Jewish scholarship. In 1931, about 7,364 Jews lived in Dubno out of a total population of 12,000. Later, with refugees arriving from nearby towns, the Jewish population grew even more before the war. When the Germans invaded in 1941, the destruction began. The Jews were forced into a ghetto, confined, and terrorized. In 1942, a mass execution took place near the airfield and at the Tarakaniv fortress outside the city, where many people were made to dig their own graves before being shot. Out of more than 12,000 Jews, only a few hundred survived. In New York, Dubner immigrants who had already formed societies decades earlier. They lived first in the Lower East Side, sewing garments in factories and saving what little they could. As they built new lives in Brooklyn and Queens, they carried their hometown in their hearts. When the news came that Dubnow had been destroyed, the letters from home had already stopped. The silence spoke for itself. At Mount Hebron, they erected a monument to the memory of their families and friends. The gray granite stone rises square and solid, framed by simplicity. This memorial is erected in memory of our families and friends of our town, Dubner, Poland. They were innocent victims of Nazi brutality from 1939 to 1935. Their sacred memory will always be enshrined in our hearts. At the center, a small relief of burning flames stands within a circle, a quiet symbol of light that endures even in devastation. The monument rests near the very cemetery road, where the sunlight strikes the face through the trees. Around it, other stones bear the names of Dubner families who made their lives in New York. Together, they form a circle of memory surrounding the flame with the lives they continue to honor. If you stand there long enough, you can sense what it meant for those early immigrants to shape memory into something lasting. They could not rebuild Dubnow streets or synagogues, but they could give the town a permanent resting place in America. Their monument became an anchor, holding the story of Dubnow steady in wind's time. A short walk brings us to the section of the Chateaurour Association. Chateaurour, now called Khodorov, was a railway town about 20 miles southeast of Lviv, in what is now western Ukraine. Jews had lived there since at least the 17th century, and by the early 1940s, the community numbered thousands. In 1942, many of Chateaurour's Jews were deported to Belzec extermination camp. Those who remained were later taken to the outskirts of the town, near an old sugar factory, and shot. By the war's end, only few survived. The wooden Great Synagogue, built in the 1650s and famous for its painted zodiac ceiling and Hebrew inscriptions, was destroyed. A model of the ceiling now stands in the Museum of the Jewish People in Tel Aviv, one of the last echoes of beauty and faith. In New York, the members of Chateaurour Young Men's Benevolent Society gathered after the war to mourn and remember. They raised the monument at Mount Hebron Cemetery in memory of the 1,700 men and women and children of Chateaurour who were murdered between 1941 and 1943. The monument stands tall and slender, carved from pale gray granite. At its top is a Star of David encircled by a laurel, a symbol of victory through remembrance. Beneath it, the English inscription reads, "Dedicated to the memory of 1,700 men, women, and children of Chateaurour, Poland, innocently and cruelly slain at the brutal hands of the Nazi invaders, 1941 to 1943. Hebrew fills the upper half of the stone, and its letters are etched deeply, as meant to last forever." For many, this narrow piece of Queen's earth has become the final piece of the Chateaurour on the map. It is not grand, but it holds everything: loss, memory, and the faith that the act of remembrance itself is the answer to destruction. Every time a visitor stops before this monument, the bridge between the past and the present is rebuilt. To stand here is to join two worlds, one buried in Galicia and one alive in Queens. The Charterhouse stones not only mark the dead, it bears witness to the living who refuse to let them be forgotten. Not all monuments at Mount Hebron mark towns. One honors a world of art and language, the world of Yiddish theater. Before the war, Yiddish theater thrived in Warsaw, Vilna, and Odessa, and other cities across Eastern Europe. It was the heart of Jewish cultural life, where audiences laughed, cried, and found themselves reflected on the stage. When Jewish immigrants came to New York, they brought that living tradition with them. On the Lower East Side, 2nd Avenue became known as Yiddish Broadway. Actors such as Molly Picon, Morris Schwartz, and Paul Mooney carried the voices, humor, and canvases of the shtetl to American audiences. For thousands of immigrants, the theater was not only entertainment, but also a lifeline, a place to belong and remember who they were. The Holocaust destroyed so much of that vibrant world. The actors, singers, musicians, and playwrights who had once filled theaters in Warsaw, Vilna, and Odessa were deported and murdered. Their songs ended mid-performance. Their audience vanished. What had once been the language of laughter and tears became a language of mourning. At Mount Hebron, their colleagues raised the monument of gray granite. It is a tall, unadorned pillar standing quietly among rows of stones, inscribed in both Hebrew and English. There are no masks, no flames, only words. Its simplicity gives it strength. The bench beside it invites visitors to sit, to think, to listen for the echoes of a silent stage. Each fall, members of Yiddish Theatrical Alliance gather at this spot. They offer prayers, songs, and silence. In that moment, the cemetery becomes a theater once again, and remembrance becomes the performance. And beyond the stone rows of this section lies Queens itself, a borough built by immigrants, where languages, stories, and memories from across the world have taken root, creating a living map of remembrance that continues to grow. Mount Hebron stands in the heart of Queens, often called the world's borough. Nearly half of its residents were born abroad, and well over 160 languages are spoken in its neighborhoods. For Jewish immigrants from Lytton, Dubnow, and Charterhouse, Queens was more than a place to live, it was a place to preserve. They came through Ellis Island, they worked in factories, peddled goods, and eventually settled in areas like Brooklyn and Queens. There they built synagogues, cultural groups, and landsmanshaften societies that kept alive the names and traditions of their towns. Mount Hebron became a meeting ground between the old world and the new world. Survivors and mourners inscribed the geography of a vanished Jewish Europe into a New York landscape. The cemetery became a place where memory could take root again, where languages of the old could still be read, where they were no longer spoken. To walk through Mount Hebron is to see the story of immigration and loss written side by side. It reminds us that the history of Queens, with all of its diversity, is also a history of endurance. The borough became a living mosaic of voices, and within this cemetery, it serves as a quiet heart still beating with memory. The monuments are more than markers. They're messages sent across time. They were placed by people who lost everything, yet refused to let their loved ones be forgotten. Each monument is like a letter that arrived decades too late. The letter that once came in the mail and was written in ink. These are written in stone. They tell us what was lost and what still endures. They speak for the children who never grew up, for the parents who never grew old, and for the artists whose stories were left unfinished. Now the responsibility passes on to us. The societies that built these memorials may have dissolved, many of their members buried, their halls empty, but the stones remain. They wait for us to read them, to speak the names out loud, and to carry the stories forward. When we pause before these stones, we become part of their story. Each time we speak a name, light a candle, or teach a young person what happened, we answer the silence that once followed the war. In doing so, we continue the work begun by those first mourners who refused to forget. These are the last letters from Europe, sent across time so all the voices silenced there may still be heard. And this is our charge, our sacred duty, and our impetus to remember. Thank you.
Deirdre, that was sort of moved to tears. We're going to ask everyone for a brief moment while we transition to sit down, and we will do a Q&A in a moment. We are back. Thank you all so much for these presentations. I mean, it's really been quite a trajectory to learn about the historical understanding of what the societies were, all of the different meanings, and then how the memory really comes to life in Queens. Before we get too far, we had a couple of questions from folks tuning in on Zoom, and I just wanted to put these out there first. And the first is, in general, how many societies at Mount Hebron are still administratively active with points of contact, and what kinds of activities are there involving those societies?
I'll take that one. So originally, Mount Hebron had between 1,200 and 1,250 burial societies, and we have just over 550 active burial societies. And when I say active, I use it very loosely. An active burial society could mean that we have somebody to talk to, somebody who has the records, and the records could just be a map. So that answers the first part. And then the second part is there's very few burial societies that are actually still providing like value to their members. There are a handful. Deirdre and I deal with burial society issues on a daily basis, but the majority of them are just simply around to fulfill the burial, the graves that are still left to be used.
And for people who have family members there, or we've had several sort of inquiries, how can people get in touch with you if they want to find out more about loved ones or societies at Mount Hebron?
Yeah, so Deirdre and I are available to talk. Our office is readily available. You can visit us online. You can visit us in person. You can call us. Our website is mounthebroncemetery.com. We encourage you and your families to reach out and learn more, learn what you can, and we can put you in touch with those people, the fiduciaries that still exist.
Fiduciaries, a word I've spent some time doing some research on. Susannah, I have a question for you. There was a moment when you were talking about the transition of the landsmanshaften from sort of communal support to the sort of grittier and sadder work of memory after the Holocaust. But you said something in there also about how some of the stones also are calling for revenge or to avenge the deaths. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yes, well, this is language that you can actually see. It's both in the Ginsberg, the memory books, but I'm mic'd up. Would that be easier?
Yeah.
Or yeah. How is that?
Perfect.
Okay, good. But yeah, this is actually language that you see both, and you could see some of it on the stones that Deirdre highlighted, that they're very explicit in naming the perpetrators of these crimes, using language such as barbarous Nazis, tyrants,
Savages.
you know, they often, in the Yiskabisha, they use language that you see, it can be very biblical, saying Amalek, or really calling them explicitly murderers. But yeah, may God avenge their blood is actually a very common phrase among the Yiskabisha, and it's just an older call, and a lot of them were calling for, both through the force of God, but in some cases, these communities could be active in trying to seek, justice for their murdered friends and families. And in some cases, in the 1970s and 80s, with the later trials and the Nazi hunting, the one I brought up, the Sefer Lubomel, that one actually it wasn't solely on the Yizkor book, but it was entered as state's evidence because it was found that these two brothers were living in Philadelphia who had taken part in the crimes. They lived in the same Ukrainian village, and they had murdered their neighbors. There were witnesses, and so there were actually protests outside these men's houses. And one of them, at least I know, did choose to self-deport before he was forcibly deported for lying on his immigration forms.
It's really, when you said that, it actually stood out. There is a memorial stone, I'm changing context entirely, in Srebrenica in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and it always stood out to me. It's in the language of the mothers calling for revenge, if that's maybe not the exact language, but it just kind of really stood out. And Deirdre, I have a question for you, because you oversee the interns working on these projects, and so one of the questions is how can people volunteer with the Legacy Foundation? But I was wondering if you could also speak to, here at the center, we spend most of the time bringing students and community members through some fairly sad, intense, heavy memory work. But there's also fun in doing this research, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that.
Well, what we encourage families to do who have loved ones buried at Mount Hebron is to help continue their legacy. So we ask families to reach out to us and let us know about, their loved one, because you don't need to be, a Yiddish theater actor to have a beautiful legacy and to be important in your community, in your family. And as far as the research goes, if people wanted to volunteer, it would be amazing just to hear different stories from people, to hear how you feel, about your society or your memories of, perhaps when the landsmanshaften were still, active and the things that you experienced. In regards to the internship, what we pretty much do with our students, most of them are Queens College graduate students, we tell them whatever interests you. And so we find ourselves going in a million directions and studying notable people and family legacies and creating audio tours and just doing this amazing work, because when we ask you to come to us, we ask you to share your story and what you learn, how you wish to express it.
There's 230,000 Jewish people buried at Mount Hebron. So when we get an intern, we say, what do you like to do? What are you interested in? And then research those people at Mount Hebron, or research that topic at Mount Hebron and bring us content, and so that we can share it with the public. So we've noticed that the kids actually really enjoy doing the work. And I think we've had 26 students now through the program, and since 2019, and a lot of positive feedback.
It's been really exciting to meet with you both over the past several years to try to figure out a collaboration together. And in fact, some of those conversations not only led to this event, but I also want to mention Dr. Samuel Gruber and his colleague Haim Shakid at the University of Miami, who created something called the International Holocaust Memorial Monuments Database. And we're going to be featuring Dr. Gruber on Monday, April 13th for our Yom HaShoah commemoration to talk about the field of memorialization, Holocaust monuments in particular, more broadly. And I guess my last question, Adam, is can you talk a little bit about the layers of the cemetery? Because I know recently I saw you had an event for, I think, the Yiddish theater there. And again, it's sort of bringing life in. I remember visiting Greenwood once at the Greenwood Cemetery, and they said, this is a place of life. This was a place designed to have picnics and to do a stroll. And so I'm wondering what kind of initiatives do you do at Mount Hebron to kind of bring this in together?
Okay, so in 2019, I was invited to speak at Kensico Cemetery about my great uncle who was killed in action in Italy. And obviously my grandfather meant a lot to me, and I remember him telling me these stories. And I was trying to figure out a way how Jewish cemeteries can participate in these foundation-like issues. Like Greenwood Cemetery, who is like the creme de la creme of nonprofit cemetery work, they do like stargazing at night and movie theaters in the mausoleum. That's not things that we do at Jewish cemeteries, right? We consider our places holy ground, if you would, akin to like a Catholic cemetery or a Catholic institution. So basically, Deirdre and I have put a lot of thought into ways that we can bring people onto the grounds in a thoughtful and respectful way that really coincides with being Jewish and doing things on a Jewish cemetery. So this past September and for the last 5 Septembers, we've had the Yiddish theater at the cemetery where Deirdre and I have a great relationship with the leadership there. And we had 2 people come. I encourage you all to visit our website and check it out. And they played, this mother and son combo from the Upper West Side played the violin and what's that instrument? Accordion. The accordion. And they sang Yiddish. What they did is they sang songs from the Yiddish theater, written and performed by the people who are buried around them. And it was so moving and it was so fun, and we literally had people dancing in the streets. So it was quite special.
I'm just going to tag on to the Yiddish theatrical, but it's also a beautiful ceremony with Cantor Moishi Bear and Koya Breyer, and it's very beautiful. And we even all sang together the Hymn of the Partisans, which was, famous during World War II in the ghettos. There's a lot of serenity, prayer, thoughtfulness, mindfulness in it. And what also we have done is we have invited students in from the Air Force ROTC because we have identified 2,500 Jewish war veterans from World War II.
Well, all wars.
What?
All wars.
Well, yeah, mostly from World War II. And they come and they respectfully flag the graves and salute them each Memorial Day and each Veterans Day. And we are actually currently working on a curriculum with students. We are going to have 60 fifth graders come to our cemetery at Mount Hebron to study your family's stones, the symbology, the language, and hopefully they're going to have a takeaway of understanding the culture, the meaning, the symbolism, the importance of the serenity and the, religiosity of, a Jewish cemetery. So we're really trying to educate everyone on a whole, Jewish people and everybody else about the contributions to Jewish culture. We're also planning on doing audio tours of the many things that we've created audio tours on, and we've created curriculums for middle school and high school. So we are planning on just trying to educate everybody that we can, bring into the fold.
I love it. And Dr. Stan Gruber actually mentioned, and Adam, you brought this book this evening. It is called Carved in Granite, Holocaust Memorials in Greater New York, Jewish Cemeteries. And it came out in 2003 for those of you who are interested in Holocaust memorials, specifically at cemeteries. We're going to wrap up in a minute, but I do have a question for you, Susannah, which is when we started, Adam and Deirdre and I were kind of thinking about the sort of focus of the presentation, and then we found you, and you are so passionate about landsmanshaften, and I was wondering where that passion comes from, and how did you get into this particular aspect of history? What's your connection to it?
Well, several years ago, this was really during, I think, 2020, 2021, during the pandemic, I was looking into my now husband's family history. And one place I saw the name show up of their town, Obadovka, now Obadivka in Ukraine, was in the Obadovka Independent Verein, which was the landsmanshaften, one of the landsmanshaften that my husband's great-grandparents were a part of. They were, one was from Pruzhany and what's now Belarus, so they were both part of both landsmanshaften. And the photo that I found, it's the only photo I found of pre-war life in Obadivka. It was of a memorial created by the Obadovka Independent Verein in Philadelphia. They erected it in Obadovka for the victims of the pogroms of 1919, 1920. And so this monument, they took a photo of it at the time. And now the Jewish community of Obadovka no longer lives there, no longer there, but that monument has stayed there.
Wow.
And so I became very passionate researching it. It became my total focus. I had loved YIVO for many years, so when they got the money to create a finding aid for their landsmanshaften collection, they created 2 archival intern spots, and I jumped on it, and with that internship, I was able to go through pretty much the whole collection, just recording everything that was in it. And I really grew to love the stories that were in these landsmanshaften, because so much of Jewish daily life was really in them, but you don't see them reflected in popular culture, for example.
Well, I think you're bringing up a really interesting point, and you were speaking about at some point there was a shift in the landsmanshaften where unless you were related to somebody in it, they weren't necessarily growing anymore. But this is actually a different way of growing them, because you're interested in it by way of connection and love for someone in your life. And I think that that's something we also see in the field of Holocaust education more broadly, is not people who only have sad connections to the Holocaust because people were lost or people were killed, but also people who are just generally curious, who come into the field and want to make these connections between the past and present. And I think we're going to wrap up, but I wanted to mention 2 comments that came in, and one is from the president of the Yiddish Theatrical Alliance.
Corey.
Yep, Corey's online, and he thanks you both for all the work that you've done together. And also, there is a comment from someone whose parents are from Dąbrówna Tarnowska, Poland, and they're buried at Mount Hebron, and they're part of the B'nai Rappaport Anshel Dąbrówna. Does this sound
Yes,
right?
yes, I know that society.
Yeah.
Yes. So, to the person who wrote in, yes, Mount Hebron, Adam and Deirdre are very much aware of it. So I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. We're really, really grateful for all your support. And we hope that you'll come to more of the KHC's events online and in person. We've got 2 next week, one featuring Ilya Kavinsky, who is a young poet from Ukraine. He will be online at the center on Tuesday. And on Wednesday, we're featuring a book talk with Daniel Brook. He's the author of a biography on Magnus Hirschfeld. So we hope you all stay safe and well during these uncertain times. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.